The Wild West was a land of guns, greed, snow, and survival. But in one lonely Wyoming cabin, a widow and a ruthless rancher discovered that the strongest thing on the frontier was not a weapon. It was mercy. Listen until the end, because this story may change the way you think about love, family, and forgiveness.
The wind didn't just blow in Wyoming. It screamed. It was the dead of winter, 1878. Snow fell like shattered glass. Abigail Foster stood alone outside the Red Dog Saloon. She shivered. Her thin wool coat offered no mercy against the storm. Her boots were worn right through the soles. She had just buried her husband. 3 hours ago, the frozen ground took him. He left her with nothing but a crushing mountain of medical debt. She was penniless, she was freezing, and she was entirely out of options. A heavy boot crunched the snow behind her. Abigail turned. Bartholomew Higgins stood there, the town loan shark. He smelled of cheap whiskey, wet wool, and greed. "Time is up, widow," Bart growled. He stepped closer. He blocked the biting wind, but brought a different kind of chill. "You owe me $50. I want it in cash. Right now." Abigail stared at the snowdrifts. She didn't even have 50 cents. Bart smiled. It was a cold, ugly thing. He pulled a folded contract from his heavy coat. "Or you sign this," he said. He tapped the paper with a thick finger. "You go upstairs. You work off your debt in the saloon's back rooms. It's a warm bed, Abby. It beats freezing to death out here in the street." Abigail didn't look at the paper. She looked up. She stared straight into his dark, calculating eyes. Her jaw was tight. Her voice shook from the freezing cold, but not from fear. She squared her shoulders. "A woman is not a commodity or collateral," Abigail said, her voice cutting sharp and clear through the howling wind. "We have the right to our own dignity, and we have the right to dictate the fate of our own lives. Mr. Higgins, I will not sign my soul away to you." Bart's face twisted into an angry snarl. The false kindness vanished. He reached out. He grabbed her thin arm, his grip like an iron vise. Then a sound cut through the storm. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the saloon piano. It was a cry, a baby's wail, sharp, desperate, terrified. It came from inside the saloon. Bart hesitated for just a second. That was all Abigail needed. She yanked her arm free. She pushed through the heavy, swinging saloon doors. The heat of the room hit her face. It smelled of stale beer, wood smoke, and sweat. The piano player had stopped. The rowdy gamblers were dead silent. Everyone was staring at the bar. A small, woven basket sat on the sticky mahogany wood. Inside it, a baby boy kicked and screamed. He was maybe 6 months old, wrapped in a dirty, fraying blanket. Sheriff Miller stood next to the basket. He held a crumpled piece of paper in his hand. He looked tired. "Note says the father is a hand at the Vance Ranch," the sheriff announced to the quiet room. "Left town yesterday. Mother's gone." A tall shadow detached itself from the far corner of the bar. Harrison Vance. He was the coldest rancher in the territory. A man built like a granite mountain. He had eyes like frozen iron and a heart rumored to be just as hard. He had only come into town for rifle shells. He wanted no part of this town. He certainly wanted no part of its people. The sheriff picked up the woven basket. He walked straight over to Harrison. He shoved the crying bundle directly against the rancher's massive chest. "Your hand. Your problem, Vance," the sheriff said. "Town ain't paying to feed this orphan." Harrison froze. The terrifying rancher, the man who could break a wild Mustang without breaking a sweat. He didn't know what to do. His hands hovered awkwardly at his sides. He stared down at the crying infant like it was a lit stick of dynamite. He was completely paralyzed. He had become a father overnight, and the panic in his eyes was real. Behind Abigail, the saloon doors banged open. Bart Higgins stormed in. He marched straight for her. He reached out and grabbed her arm again, his fingers digging, bruising deep into her skin. "You are coming upstairs, widow," Bart hissed, pulling her toward the staircase. Abigail looked at Bart. She looked at the giant, helpless rancher. She looked at the crying baby. Survival on the frontier required a leap of faith. She dug her heels into the floorboards. She ripped her arm out of Bart's grip with all her remaining strength. She stepped right into the middle of the room. She placed herself squarely between the angry loan shark and the frozen rancher. She looked up into Harrison Vance's icy eyes. "Take me with you," Abigail said. Her voice was steady now. It echoed in the quiet saloon. "I will wet nurse and raise the boy. In exchange, you protect me from this man." The saloon was dead quiet. Harrison Vance stared at the woman in front of him.
Abigail Foster.
She was small. She was shivering violently. Her coat was nothing but rags. But she stood between him and the loan shark like a brick wall. Bart Higgins broke the silence with a sneer. He took a step forward. "Move aside, Vance. The widow belongs to me. She has a debt to pay." Harrison didn't speak. He didn't argue. He just moved. His right hand dropped to his hip. The heavy Colt, .45, cleared leather in a blur. His thumb pulled the hammer back. The metallic click echoed in the silent room. It was loud. It was final. He pointed the iron barrel straight at Bart's chest. "Take a step back, Higgins," Harrison said. His voice was low. It sounded like stones grinding together. "The lady made a deal. She goes with me." Bart froze. The color drained from his face. He looked at the gun. He looked at Harrison as dead, cold eyes. Bart raised his hands slowly.
He took one step.
Back, then another. "You're making a mistake." "Vance," Bart spit out. "She owes me $50. "Take it up with the bank," Harrison said. He didn't look at Abigail. He just nodded toward the saloon doors. "Grab the basket. We are leaving." Abigail didn't hesitate. She rushed to the mahogany bar. She scooped up the woven basket. The baby, Samuel, was still crying. His little face was red. He was hungry and terrified. Abigail tucked the basket close to her chest. She wrapped her thin arms around it, trying to share what little body heat she had. She followed Harrison out the swinging doors. The wind hit them like a physical blow. The blizzard had gotten worse. The snow was falling so thick, Abigail couldn't see across the street. Harrison's wagon was tied to a hitching post. A team of 2 dark horses stomped their hooves in the snow. They were anxious. They wanted to go home. "Get in the back," Harrison ordered. He kept his voice loud over the howling wind. "There are wool blankets under the tarp. Wrap the boy. Wrap yourself." Abigail climbed up into the wagon bed. Her hands were numb. Her fingers felt like blocks of wood. She fumbled with the heavy canvas tarp. She found the rough wool blankets beneath it. They smelled of horses and dust. Right now, they smelled like heaven. She sat in the corner of the wagon bed. She placed the basket on her lap. She threw 2 thick blankets over herself and the baby, creating a small, dark tent. Harrison climbed into the driver's seat. He didn't look back. He snapped the reins. "Ha!" The horses lunged forward. The wagon jolted. They left the town behind. The ride was a nightmare. The road was gone. There was only white. The wagon wheels bounced over hidden rocks and deep snowdrifts. Every bump sent a shock of pain up Abigail's spine. The wind screamed through the cracks in the wagon bed. It sliced through the wool blankets. It bit at her skin. Inside her dark little tent, Abigail held the baby. Samuel had stopped crying. That worried her more than the screaming. He was too cold. He was too weak. She opened her tattered coat. She unbuttoned her worn dress. She took the baby out of the basket and pressed his small, shivering body directly against her bare chest. Skin to skin, it was the only way to keep him alive. She wrapped the blankets tight around them both. "Hold on, little one," she whispered into the dark. Her teeth chattered. "Just hold on." They rode for 2 hours. It felt like 2 days. The cold seeped into Abigail's bones. Her toes went completely numb. Her mind started to drift. She thought of her late husband. She thought of the warm fire they used to share. Sleep felt very tempting. It would be so easy to just close her eyes. Then the wagon stopped. The sudden stillness jolted Abigail awake. She heard Harrison's heavy boots hit the snow. A moment later, the canvas tarp was pulled back. The bitter wind slapped her face. Harrison stood there. His face was covered in snow. His beard was frozen white. "We're here," he said gruffly. "Get inside." Abigail struggled to stand. Her legs wouldn't work. She was stiff from the cold. She clutched the baby tightly to her chest. Harrison reached out. He grabbed her arm with a heavy, leather-gloved hand. He practically lifted her out of the wagon. She looked up. Through the swirling snow, she saw the cabin. It was a sturdy structure made of thick pine logs, but it was entirely dark. There was no smoke coming from the chimney. There was no light in the windows. It looked like a tomb. Harrison kicked the heavy front door open. He pushed her inside. The cabin was freezing. It was barely warmer than the storm outside. It smelled of old ash, leather, and loneliness. Harrison walked straight to the fireplace. He didn't light a lamp. He worked in the dark. He threw logs onto the grate. He struck a match. He blew on the sparks. Within a minute, a fire caught. The yellow light flickered, pushing the shadows back. "Sit on the rug," Harrison said. He pointed to a braided rug right in front of the hearth. "Warm the boy." Abigail sank onto the rug. She unwrapped the blankets slightly. She held Samuel toward the growing fire. The heat touched the baby's pale skin. A few moments later, Samuel let out a weak, sputtering cry. Abigail closed her eyes. She let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. He was alive. Harrison walked to a wooden cupboard. He pulled out a tin of condensed milk and a small metal pan. He set the pan on the hot stones near the fire. He poured the milk in. "It's not proper milk," Harrison said. He didn't look at her. "It's what I have." "It will do," Abigail said. Her voice was scratchy. "Thank you." Harrison stood up. He towered over her. The firelight cast long, harsh shadows across his face. He looked down at her. His expression was completely blank. He looked like a man made of iron. "Don't thank me," Harrison said. His tone was sharp, cold. "I didn't bring you here out of the goodness of my heart. I brought you here because I refuse to swing from a rope if that town decides I starved a baby to death." Abigail looked up at him. She didn't flinch. "You sleep by the fire tonight," Harrison continued. He crossed his arms over his broad chest. "You will feed the boy. You will keep him quiet. But let's get one thing straight, Mrs. Foster. You are a problem I did not ask for. When the ice thaws in the spring, the roads will clear. When that happens, you and the boy pack up. You leave my land. This frontier has no room for the weak, and I have no room for a family." Abigail looked at the sleeping baby. Then she raised her chin. She met Harrison's icy stare. She did not look away. "You have a very harsh view of the world, Mr. Vance," Abigail said. Her voice was quiet, but it was firm. It held no fear. "I have a realistic view," Harrison shot back. "Nature is cruel. It kills the weak. That is the law out here." Abigail shook her head. She pulled the baby closer. "Nature is cruel." "Yes," Abigail said, speaking clearly, making sure every word carried the weight of her conviction. "But nature's cruelty does not excuse a man's coldness. A civilized society is measured purely by how it treats its most vulnerable members. Helping a widow and an orphan is not a burden to be managed, Mr. Vance. It is the basic moral obligation of any decent human being. We are not animals simply surviving. We are people, and people must protect one another. Harrison stared at her. His jaw tightened. The muscle in his cheek twitched. He was not used to being spoken to like this. He was used to people shrinking away from him. He didn't argue. He just turned his back on her. "Feed the boy," Harrison muttered. He walked toward the dark back room of the cabin. "I have cattle to check." He walked out the back door, stepping right back into the screaming blizzard. Abigail was left alone with the fire. She touched the warm milk. She dipped a clean piece of cloth into the pan, letting the baby suck the warm milk from the fabric. She watched the flames dance. They had survived the night, but the real storm was just beginning. Morning came, but the light did not. The blizzard still raged outside. The wind hammered against the thick pine logs of the cabin. The windows were completely frosted over. They were trapped in a world of ice. Abigail woke up on the braided rug. Her neck was stiff, her back ached from the hard wooden floor. But the fire was roaring. The hearth was warm. She looked down. Baby Samuel was asleep against her chest. He was breathing steadily. His cheeks had a healthy pink color. Abigail sat up slowly. She looked around the cabin. In the daylight, she could see how truly barren it was. It was a large room, but it felt empty. There was a rough-hewn wooden table, two heavy chairs, a cast-iron stove in the corner, shelves holding basic supplies, tins of beans, coffee, flour. There were no curtains. There were no rugs, except the one she slept on. There were no pictures on the walls. It was a house built for survival. It was not a home. The heavy back door swung open. Harrison walked in. A blast of freezing air followed him. He quickly shoved the door shut and threw the heavy iron bolt. He was covered in snow. He carried an armful of split firewood. He didn't say good morning. He didn't ask how she slept. He walked to the fireplace and dropped the wood into a heavy iron basket with a loud crash. He took off his leather gloves and beat the snow off his heavy canvas coat. Abigail stood up. She shifted the baby to one arm. She used her free hand to smooth her wrinkled, dirty dress. She felt like a mess, but she held her head high. "Good morning, Mr. Vance," she said. Harrison grunted. He walked over to the wooden table. He pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. He pulled a leather pouch from his coat pocket. He untied the thick leather string. He reached inside and pulled out a handful of silver coins. He dropped them onto the center of the table. Clack, clack, clack. The sound line was sharp in the quiet cabin. "Let's settle our business," Harrison said. He didn't look at her. He looked at the money. "We are stuck here. The snow is 5 feet deep at the gate. No one is getting in or out for weeks." Abigail walked over to the table. She stood opposite him. She looked at the coins, then at him. "I'll be working outside," Harrison continued. His voice was flat, businesslike. "The cattle need feed. The ice in the troughs needs breaking. I don't have time to play nursemaid." He pointed a thick finger at her. "You stay inside," he ordered. "You keep the fire burning. You keep the boy quiet. You cook the meals, and you wash the clothes. You are my hired help until the spring. This money is your first month's wages. It pays for your services as a maid and a wet nurse. Nothing more." He pushed the pile of silver coins across the rough timber table toward her. "Take it," he said, "and stay out of my way." Abigail looked down at the silver coins. $50. Exactly the amount she had owed Bart Higgins. To Harrison Vance, this was simple math. He was buying a service. He was purchasing a wall to put between himself and the crying infant. He was trying to assert his dominance, treating her as a subordinate to keep his emotional distance intact. Abigail's jaw tightened. Her blood began to boil. She did not reach for the money. She did not nod. Instead, she reached her free hand out. She placed her fingertips against the silver coins, and she pushed them slowly, deliberately, right back across the table toward him. Harrison frowned. His eyes narrowed. He looked up at her, genuinely confused. No one on the frontier refused silver. Abigail stood tall. The exhaustion faded from her face, replaced by a fierce, undeniable pride. "I will not take your money, Mr. Vance," Abigail said. Her voice was steady, ringing with an authority that matched his own. "Don't be a fool," Harrison snapped. "You're destitute. You need it." "I need to survive," Abigail corrected him sharply. She looked him dead in the eye. She did not blink. She spoke clearly, ensuring he heard every single syllable. "I sell my labor to feed this child, not my self-respect. You will not buy my dignity with silver to make yourself feel comfortable. Under this roof, we are facing the same winter. The one who chops the wood out in the blizzard and the one who tends the fire and raises the child inside contribute equal value. My work is not lesser than yours just because it happens indoors. We are equals in survival, Mr. Vance. I will do my share, but I am your partner in this hardship, not your servant." Silence fell over the cabin. The wind outside seemed to fade away. The only sound was the crackle of the burning logs in the hearth. Harrison Vance sat perfectly still. He stared at her. His eyes, usually so cold and empty, were sharp now. He was studying her. He was looking at her ragged clothes, her bruised wrists, and the fierce fire burning in her tired eyes. He had expected a weeping widow. He had expected a frightened bird he could easily control. He had not expected this. Slowly, Harrison reached out. He swept the silver coins back into his large hand. He dropped them into the leather pouch and pulled the string tight. He put the pouch back into his coat pocket. He stood up. He was a foot taller than her, but right now, Abigail felt like she was looking him right in the eye. "The flour is in the barrel by the door," Harrison said softly. His voice had lost its sharp edge. It was just a low rumble now. "The bacon is hanging in the cellar. There is coffee in the tin." He turned and walked toward the back door. He grabbed his heavy leather gloves. He put his hand on the iron latch. He stopped. He didn't turn around, but he spoke over his broad shoulder. "Breakfast by 6. Dinner by sundown," Harrison said. "Partner." He opened the door and stepped out into the storm. Abigail let out a long breath. Her knees felt a little weak. She looked down at the baby in her arms. Samuel was awake now, staring up at her with big, curious eyes. Abigail smiled. It was a small, tired smile, but it was real. "All right, little one," she whispered to the baby. "Let's go to work." She didn't waste a minute. Abigail moved through the cabin with purpose. She found a large wooden crate. She dragged it near the fireplace, but not too close. She folded the thickest wool blankets and lined the bottom of the crate. She created a safe, warm cradle. She laid Samuel down inside. Then, she tied an old canvas apron over her dress. The work was brutal. The 1878 frontier demanded blood and sweat for every comfort. She hauled water from the indoor pump. The water was freezing cold. Her hands ached and turned bright red as she scrubbed Samuel's dirty cloth diapers in a tin bucket. She used coarse lye soap that burned her knuckles. She hung the wet cloths on a heavy iron line, strung up near the fireplace. She opened the iron stove. She hauled heavy pieces of split pine to feed its belly. She found the flour. She mixed it with water and a pinch of salt, kneading the stiff dough until her shoulders burned. She shaped it into hardtack biscuits and threw them onto a cast iron skillet. She found the cellar trapdoor. She climbed down into the dark, freezing dirt room. She used a heavy butcher knife to saw off a thick chunk of salted bacon. The cabin began to smell different. The smell of dust and loneliness was gone. It was replaced by the rich smell of frying bacon, baking bread, and boiling coffee. At exactly noon, the heavy front door opened. Harrison walked in. He looked exhausted. His face was windburned. His clothes were stiff with ice. He stopped in his tracks. The cabin was warm. Boiling hot water sat in a kettle on the stove. Clean clothes hung near the fire. The baby was sleeping soundly in a makeshift cradle. And on the wooden table, a tin plate was set. 2 thick, warm biscuits, a mountain of fried bacon, a steaming tin cup of black coffee. Abigail was at the sink, scrubbing the iron skillet. She didn't look back. "Food is hot," she said simply. Harrison didn't say a word. He took off his coat. Hat sat down at the table. He picked up a biscuit. He took a bite. He closed his eyes for just a second. He ate in complete silence. He finished every crumb. He drank every drop of coffee. When he was done, he stood up. He walked over to the stove. He picked up the heavy water kettle. He poured the boiling water into a wash basin for her. He didn't speak. He just nodded his head once. A single, sharp nod of respect. Then, he put his coat back on and walked back out into the blizzard. They had an agreement. It wasn't built on money. It wasn't built on friendship. It was built on the quiet, heavy understanding of shared labor. The pragmatism of survival had begun, and in the silent, rhythmic chopping of wood and baking of bread, the frozen ice in the Vance cabin was just beginning to crack. Winter in Wyoming did not measure time in days or hours. It measured time in firewood and flour. The great blizzard blew itself out after a week. But the cold did not leave. It settled over the valley. It locked the world in a cage of solid, glittering ice. The snowdrifts piled 6 feet high against the barn doors. The pine trees bowed under the heavy white weight. The sky was a pale, blinding blue. Inside the Vance cabin, a silent rhythm took hold. It was a brutal routine. It left no room for grief. It left no room for pity. Survival demanded every ounce of their blood and sweat. Wake before the sun. Break the frozen crust of ice in the indoor water bucket. Strike the flint. Feed the fire. Boil the water. Grind the coffee beans. They moved around each other like 2 solitary wolves sharing a tight cave. They rarely spoke. Words wasted breath. Words wasted energy. Abigail's hands were the first things to change. When she had arrived at the ranch, her hands were worn, but they were still the hands of a town woman. 2 weeks of raw frontier living stripped that away entirely. The chores were endless, and they were violent. She washed Samuel S. cloth diapers in a heavy tin tub. The water had to be boiled on the iron stove. The soap she used was a harsh, yellow block of lye and rendered animal fat. It ate at the skin on her fingers. It burned her nail beds. She scrubbed the heavy cotton against a ribbed washboard, back and forth, up and down, until her shoulders screamed, until her knuckles cracked and bled into the soapy water. She hung the wet cloths on a heavy hemp line, strung across the room. Heat from the fireplace dried them stiff. At night, when the cabin was dark, Abigail sat by the dying embers. She would rub a small dab of mutton tallow into her bleeding knuckles. She would wince. She would wrap her hands in scraps of old linen. She did it just so she could bend her fingers the next morning to start all over again. She never complained. Not once. Harrison watched her. He didn't mean to. He tried to keep his eyes on his plate, or on the fire, or on the floor. But in a one-room cabin, you cannot hide. He noticed the bandages on her hands. He noticed the dark circles under her eyes. He noticed the way she limped slightly by nightfall, her back aching from carrying heavy buckets of water from the indoor pump. He was a man who respected strength. He had spent his whole life breaking wild horses and surviving savage winters. He despised weakness. He had fully expected Abigail to break. He expected her to weep. He expected her to beg him for an easier load. She did not. Instead, she fought the cabin. She fought the dirt. She fought the cold. And she won. She found a sack of dry pinto beans in the cellar. She soaked them overnight. She cooked them slow with a thick chunk of salted pork fat. She baked sourdough biscuits that rose tall and fluffy, entirely different from the hardtack she made that first day. She found Harrison S. spare canvas work coat. It was torn at the shoulder. The lining was hanging out. A nasty snag from barbed wire. Harrison had left it thrown over a chair. He planned to patch it himself with a piece of rough leather. When he came inside one evening, the coat was folded neatly on his bedroll. The tear was gone. It had been stitched shut. The threadwork was incredibly tight. It was double-looped for strength. It was a better repair job than the town tailor could have done. Harrison picked up the coat. He ran his thick thumb over the stitches. He looked over at Abigail. She was at the stove, stirring a pot of beans. Her back was to him. He didn't say thank you. But the next morning, when Abigail woke up, she found a stack of perfectly split kindling stacked right next to the stove. The logs were chopped small, exactly the size she needed to start the morning fire without having to swing the heavy axe herself. It was a silent conversation, a trait of respect. Harrison S. days were just as punishing. He was out before dawn. The cattle needed him. Out on the frozen range, nature was a merciless killer. He rode his dark gelding through chest-deep snow. He carried a heavy iron pickaxe. He rode to the frozen creek. He swung the pickaxe overhead, smashing it down into the thick ice. He swung it until his lungs burned. He broke holes in the ice so the cattle could drink. He hauled massive bales of dry hay from the barn loft. He pitched it out to the starving herd. The wind chewed at his face. The cold seeped through his wool layers. He was 42 years old. His body had taken a beating over the years. His knees ached. His lower back throbbed with a dull, constant pain. But he did not stop. He could not stop. The animals depended on him. When he finally walked back into the cabin at sundown, he was usually covered in frost and smelling of wet hide. Before Abigail arrived, coming home was the hardest part of the day. Coming home meant facing the dark. It meant facing the empty silence. It meant lighting his own fire with frozen fingers and eating cold beans straight from a tin can. Now, the cabin was different. When he pushed the heavy door open, a wave of heat hit his face. The smell of roasted coffee filled the air. A hot meal was sitting on the wooden table. And Samuel was there. The baby was changing the air in the room. He was growing fast. He had stopped crying all the time. Now he cooed. He blew bubbles. He watched the firelight dance on the ceiling. Harrison tried to ignore the boy. He kept his distance. He told himself it was just a temporary arrangement. Come spring, the child would be gone. There was no point in getting attached. Attachments out here only led to graves. He knew that better than anyone. But Samuel had a way of pulling you in. One evening, Harrison was sitting at the table. He was cleaning his rifle, a rag soaked in gun oil in his hand. Abigail was washing dishes at the pump. Samuel was in his wooden crate near the fire. The baby dropped his carved wooden spoon. It clattered onto the floorboards and rolled across the room. It stopped right against the toe of Harrison's heavy leather boot. Harrison froze. He looked down at the spoon. He looked over at the crate. Samuel had rolled onto his stomach. The baby pushed himself up on his little arms. He looked right at Harrison, and Samuel smiled. It was a wide, toothless, trusting smile. Harrison felt a strange, tight pull in his chest, a feeling he hadn't felt in a decade. He swallowed hard. He set his gun rag down. He reached down and picked up the small wooden spoon. It was covered in dust. Harrison wiped the spoon clean on his pant leg. He stood up. He walked slowly over to the crate. He felt awkward. He felt massive and clumsy. He leaned down and held the spoon out. Samuel giggled. The baby reached up with a chubby little fist and grabbed the spoon. His small fingers brushed against Harrison's thick, calloused knuckles. Harrison pulled his hand back quickly, like he had been burned. He turned around and walked straight back to the table. He picked up his rifle and scrubbed it furiously, but his hands were shaking just a little bit. Abigail watched the whole thing from the sink. She didn't say a word. She just smiled to herself, a quiet, knowing smile, and went back to scrubbing the iron skillet. The weeks bled into a month. The shared labor forged an invisible bond between them. It wasn't romance. It wasn't even friendship yet. It was a partnership born of pure grit. They anticipated each other's needs. If Harrison came in soaking wet from a sudden sleet storm, Abigail already had a pot of boiling water ready for a wash. If Abigail was running low on flour, she didn't have to ask. Harrison would haul a heavy new sack up from the cellar before she even reached the bottom of the barrel. They were surviving, and they were doing it together. It happened on a cold Tuesday night in late February. The wind had picked up again. It howled down that chimney, threatening to blow out the fire. Harrison had been out late. A heavy beam in the barn roof had cracked under the weight of the snow. He had to brace it with thick pine logs. He had swung a heavy sledgehammer for 3 hours straight. When he finally made it back to the cabin, it was past midnight. He pushed the door open quietly, trying not to wake them. The cabin was cast in deep orange shadows. The fire had burned down to glowing red coals. Harrison took off his boots by the door. He walked softly into the room. Abigail was not in her bed. She was sitting in the heavy wooden rocking chair near the hearth. She had been knitting a small wool sock for Samuel. The knitting needles rested idle in her lap. Her head was tilted back. She was fast asleep. The dark circles under her eyes looked bruised in the dim light. Her face was pale. She looked entirely spent. She looked like a woman who had given everything she had to the day and had nothing left. Harrison stood there. He looked at her for a long time. He saw the raw red skin on her hands. He saw the frayed hem of her dress. He saw the sheer, unyielding will of a woman who refused to break. He walked over to his bedroll. He picked up his heavy, fleece-lined wool blanket. He walked back to the rocking chair, very gently, moving with a quiet grace, surprising for a man his size. He draped the heavy blanket over Abigail's shoulders. He tucked the edges around her, trapping the warmth inside. Abigail sighed in her sleep. She leaned her cheek against the soft wool, but she did not wake. Harrison turned away. He walked over to the wooden crate on the floor. Samuel was awake. The baby was lying on his back, staring up at the dark ceiling. He wasn't crying. He was just awake, watching the dancing shadows cast by the dying fire. Harrison stood over the crate. He looked down at the tiny, fragile life, a life that had been thrown away by the world, a life that had ended up in the hands of a hardened, bitter man. Harrison rested his heavy hands on the edge of the wooden crate. The rough bark bit into his palms. He thought about Bart Higgins. He thought about the cruelty of the town. He thought about the men who abandoned their children, and the men who exploited widows for a handful of silver. He looked at Samuel's innocent, wide eyes. Harrison leaned down. The cabin was dead quiet, save for the howling wind outside. He spoke. His voice was a low, gravelly whisper, but the words were clear. They were distinct. He spoke them not just to the baby, but to the room, to the world, to himself. He needed to say it out loud. "No matter how ruthless the world out there gets," Harrison whispered, his voice thick with a sudden, fierce emotion, "we cannot allow the harshness to turn us into monsters. Men out there act like wolves. They prey on the weak. But that is a choice, not a law of nature. This child bears no guilt for the sins of the adults. We have a duty to shield the innocent from the cruelty of men. Compassion isn't weakness, boy. It is the only thing that keeps us human." Samuel blinked. He reached a tiny hand up toward Harrison. Harrison didn't pull away this time. He slowly lowered his hand. He let the baby's tiny, warm fingers wrap tightly around his thick, calloused index finger. The contrast was startling. The hardened fist of a killer held captive by the grip of an infant. Harrison closed his eyes. He let out a long, shaky breath. For the first time in 10 years, the ice around his heart did not just crack. It began to melt. He stood there in the dark for a long time, holding the boy's hand, while the woman who had saved them both slept peacefully under his coat. Spring did not arrive in Wyoming with blooming flowers and gentle breezes. It arrived with violence. The great thaw sounded like bones breaking. The thick ice on the creek cracked. It snapped in the middle of the night like rifle fire. The snow melted heavy and fast. It turned the pristine white world into an ocean of thick, brown mud. The isolation was over. The roads were open. Harrison stood on the front porch. He drank his black coffee. He looked down the long, muddy wagon trail leading to town. He knew what the melting snow meant. The barrier was gone. The world could get back in. He didn't have to wait long. 3 days after the final thaw, riders appeared. 4 of them, black silhouettes against the pale morning sky. Their horses churned up the wet earth. Harrison set his tin cup down. He walked inside. He picked up his Winchester repeating rifle from the table. He checked the chamber, 1 in the pipe, 12 in the tube. He walked back out and stood on the edge of the porch. Abigail came to the doorway. She held Samuel in her arms. She saw the riders. Her face went pale. "Stay inside," Harrison said. His voice was flat. "Lock the heavy bolt." Abigail stepped back. The heavy door swung shut. The iron bolt clattered into place. Harrison walked down the porch steps. His boots sank 2 inches into the mud. He walked to the wooden fence line. He waited. The riders pulled up. Their horses were breathing hard, chests heaving in the damp air. At the front was Bartholomew Higgins. Bart wore a fine woolen suit, ruined by the trail mud. He wore a bowler hat. He smiled. It was a greasy, confident smile. The 3 men behind him were hired guns, drifters with cheap leather holsters and restless eyes. "Morning, Vance," Bart called out. He rested his hands on his saddle horn. "Spring has sprung. The roads are clear. State your business, Higgins," Harrison said. He didn't raise the rifle. He just held it across his chest. Relaxed. "Ready." "I came for my property," Bart said. He pointed a thick, gloved finger toward the cabin. "The widow. Her debt is overdue. The interest has piled up over the winter. She owes me $75 now. Or she works it off. I brought an extra horse for her." "She isn't going anywhere," Harrison said. "She works for me. Her debt is her own business. But she stays on this land." Bart laughed. It was a dry, ugly sound. "This land," Bart said. He looked around the valley. He looked at the creek rushing with snowmelt. "That's a funny thing about land, Vance. It ain't worth a damn without water. You know the town council is looking at damming the North Fork? Up past the ridge, right where it feeds your creek." Harrison tightened his grip on the rifle stock. "They need a private investor," Bart continued. He grinned. His teeth were yellow. "A man with capital. A man like me. If I build that dam, your creek runs dry by July. Your cattle die of thirst. Your ranch turns to dust." It was a blatant threat. It was extortion. "You touch that water, I'll break your neck," Harrison said. It wasn't a threat. It was a simple statement of fact. Bart's smile vanished. His eyes went cold. "You can't fight the whole town, Vance. You can't fight the bank. And you can't fight me," Bart spat. "You have 1 week. Bring the woman to the saloon, or you will watch your entire life dry up and blow away." Bart yanked his horse's reins. He turned the animal hard. The 3 hired guns followed. They rode back down the muddy trail, leaving deep, ugly scars in the earth. Harrison watched them until they were out of sight. The trouble had finally arrived. For the next 2 days, Harrison rode the fence line. He checked the cattle. They had survived the winter, thin but alive. They were grazing on the fresh, green shoots pushing up through the mud near the creek. On the 3rd morning, everything changed. Harrison rode out before dawn. The mist was heavy on the ground. He reached the south pasture. He pulled his horse to a sudden halt. The air was quiet. Too quiet. He slid off the saddle. His boots hit the mud. 20 yards away, a young calf was on the ground. It was kicking its legs wildly. White foam poured from its mouth. Its eyes were rolled back in its head. Harrison ran to it. He knelt in the mud. He placed a heavy hand on the calf's flank. The animal's muscles were spasming violently. It was burning up with fever. He looked up. Another calf was down near the water edge. Then he saw a yearling stagger, drop to its knees, and let out a weak, desperate bellow. It wasn't blackleg. It wasn't tick fever. The symptoms were too fast, too violent. Harrison stood up. He walked to the edge of the creek. He looked closely at the fresh green grass. Among the natural shoots, he saw something else, a fine, white powder dusting the leaves. Poison. Bart's men hadn't just threatened the water. They had snuck back onto the property in the dead of night. They had seeded the prime grazing patch with arsenic or wolfsbane. They were making good on their promise. They were killing his livelihood. Harrison felt a cold, hard knot form in his stomach. A rancher on the frontier learned early to make terrible choices. Nature was cruel, but poisoned cattle were a different kind of tragedy. The poison was already in their blood. Their organs were failing. They were suffering in pure agony. There was no medicine in the territory that could save an animal once the violent spasms started. There was only one cure for this kind of suffering. Lead. It was the law of the West. If it's broken beyond repair, you put it down. You end the pain. It was a cold calculus, but it was necessary. Harrison walked back to his horse. His face was a mask of stone. He pulled his Winchester rifle from the saddle scabbard. He filled his pockets with extra shells. He began to walk back toward the dying animals. Back at the cabin, Abigail was hanging laundry on the porch line. She saw Harrison riding out earlier. Now, she saw his horse standing riderless in the distance. She dropped the wet sheet into the basket. She squinted against the morning sun. She saw Harrison walking through the pasture. She saw the cattle on the ground. She saw him raise the heavy rifle to his shoulder. Abigail's heart stopped. She didn't think. She didn't hesitate. She picked up the hems of her heavy skirt and she ran. She ran off the porch. She ran through the thick, sucking mud. Her boots slipped. She stumbled to her knees. She scrambled back up. Her hands were covered in dirt. She kept running. "Harrison!" she screamed. Her voice tore through the quiet valley. "Harrison, stop!" Harrison had the rifle leveled at the head of a thrashing calf. His finger was tightening on the trigger. He heard her scream. He lowered the barrel just an inch. He looked back over his shoulder. Abigail was sprinting toward him. Her chest was heaving. Her hair was falling out of its pins. She reached him. She didn't slow down. She stepped directly in front of the rifle barrel. She stood between the hardened rancher and the dying calf. "Move aside, Abigail," Harrison said. His voice was ragged. He hated this. He hated the killing. But it had to be done. "They are poisoned. Higgins did this. They are suffering. I have to put them down." "No," Abigail said. She was breathless, but she stood her ground. "You don't understand," Harrison pleaded. He tried to step around her. "Their organs are shutting down. It's agony. A bullet is mercy. Move." Abigail stepped sideways, blocking him again. She reached out. She put her small, bare hand right over the hot iron barrel of the Winchester. She pushed it down toward the mud. She looked him directly in the eyes. Her gaze was fierce. It burned with a conviction that made Harrison freeze. She took a deep breath. She spoke clearly. Her words were sharp and deliberate. She made sure there was no misunderstanding. She made sure the lesson was spoken aloud, ringing out over the tragic scene. "Put the gun down. Harrison, you listen to me. Every life is precious. We do not destroy something just because it is broken or inconvenient. That is the easy way out, the coward's way. Respecting the lives of all living creatures is how we retain our own humanity. When we treat life like it is disposable, when we choose the bullet over the burden of care, we throw away our own souls. I do not care how much pain they are in. As long as they are drawing breath, I will treat them. Now, put the gun away." Harrison stared at her. He was stunned. No one spoke to him like that. No one challenged his judgment on his own ranch. But the absolute certainty in her voice shook him. She wasn't acting out of blind emotion. She was acting out of a deep, unshakable moral code. He looked at the dying calf. He looked back at her. "There is no doctor for 50 miles, Harrison said, "and no doctor can cure arsenic." "It isn't pure arsenic," Abigail said. She dropped to her knees in the mud. She grabbed a handful of the poisoned grass. She sniffed it. She rubbed the white powder between her fingers. "It smells like nightshade, mixed with a heavy lye base. I know this smell. My father was a botanist. He taught me. I know how to bind it." She stood back up. The frail widow was gone. In her place stood a commander. "I need charcoal," Abigail ordered. Her voice cracked like a whip. "All the cold ash from the fireplace. I need the bark from the willow trees down by the creek. I need a bucket of raw eggs, and I need a vat of boiling water. Right now." Harrison didn't argue. He didn't question her. He looked at her standing in the mud, her dress ruined, her eyes blazing with life. He lowered the hammer on his rifle. He turned around and sprinted toward the cabin. The next 10 hours were a descent into hell. It was a battle against time and biology. They dragged heavy cast iron kettles out to the pasture. They built roaring fires right in the mud. Abigail stood over the boiling water. She was covered in soot and sweat. She dumped in massive amounts of crushed charcoal from the hearth. She stripped the willow bark with a hunting knife, her hands bleeding, and threw it into the dark, boiling sludge. She cracked 24 eggs into the mix. "The charcoal binds the poison in the stomach," she explained, shouting over the crackling fire. The willow eases the violent spasms. The raw egg coats the throat and stomach lining to stop the internal bleeding. Bring me the first calf. Harrison was a giant of a man, but wrestling a terrified, poisoned calf took every ounce of his strength. He tackled. The thrashing yearling. He pinned it to the muddy ground. He locked his heavy arms around its neck. Abigail rushed over with a large tin pitcher, full of the black, foul-smelling liquid. The liquid was still steaming. Hold its jaw open, she yelled. Harrison pried the calf's mouth open. The animal bucked and kicked. One sharp hoof caught Harrison in the shin, tearing his heavy denim pants and drawing blood. He didn't let go. He held the jaw wide. Abigail poured the black sludge directly down the animal's throat. She stroked its neck, forcing it to swallow. The calf gagged. It coughed up black foam onto Abigail's dress. She didn't flinch. She just poured more. Next one, she commanded. They moved from animal to animal. They fought in the mud. They were covered in dirt, blood, and vomit. The sun climbed high into the sky, beating down on them. Their muscles cramped. Their throats were parched. Harrison's back screamed in agony. But every time he thought he couldn't lift another animal, he looked at Abigail. She was relentless. She didn't stop to rest. She didn't stop to drink. She moved with a desperate, furious energy. She was fighting death with both hands, refusing to yield an inch of ground. Evening fell. The sky turned a deep bruised purple. The fires burned down to embers. The last pitcher of the black remedy was empty. There were 15 sick calves. They had treated every single one. Harrison collapsed onto the wet grass. He was completely exhausted. He couldn't feel his arms. He laid on his back, staring up at the darkening sky. His chest heaved. He heard footsteps. Soft, tired footsteps. Abigail sat down in the mud beside him. She was unrecognizable. Her face was streaked with soot. Her hair was matted to her forehead. Her hands were trembling violently from fatigue. They sat in silence. The only sound was the rushing of the creek. Slowly, the sounds began to change. The violent thrashing stopped. The ragged, wet breathing smoothed out. Harrison rolled onto his side. He pushed himself up on one elbow. He looked out over the darkening pasture. The calf that had kicked him, the one he had been about to shoot, it was no longer convulsing. It was lying quietly on its side. Its chest rose and fell in a steady, even rhythm. A few yards away, another yearling let out a soft sound. Not a cry of pain, just a tired grunt. It lifted its head. It tucked its legs underneath its body. They were alive. The poison had been neutralized. They had survived. Harrison looked over at Abigail. She was watching the calves. A single, clean tear cut a path down her soot-stained cheek. She didn't wipe it away. She just smiled. It was a beautiful, exhausted smile. Harrison realized something in that moment, something profound. He had spent his whole life building walls. He believed strength was isolation. He believed a gun was the only way to solve a deadly problem. He had been wrong. True strength wasn't the ability to pull a trigger. True strength was the sheer, stubborn refusal to let something die. It was the willingness to wade into the mud and the filth, to fight for life when death seemed entirely certain. Abigail Foster was not a fragile widow. She was the strongest person he had ever met. He sat up fully. He reached out. His large, mud-caked hand gently covered her trembling, bruised fingers. "You saved them," Harrison said. His voice was hoarse. It was barely a whisper. Abigail looked at his hand covering hers. She didn't pull away. "No, Harrison," she said softly. She looked into his eyes. "We saved them." The threat of Bartholomew Higgins was still out there. The town council was still coming for their water. The war was far from over. But as they sat together in the mud, surrounded by the quiet breathing of the animals they had pulled back from the brink, the fear was gone. They had faced the poison, and they had won. The rain fell hard. It beat against the cabin roof like 1,000 tiny hammers. It was a cold, vicious spring rain, the kind that soaked into your bones and stayed there. Abigail sat in the heavy wooden rocking chair. The fire was burning low. The iron clock on the mantel ticked loudly in the quiet room. It was past midnight. Samuel was fast asleep in his wooden crate. He had a full belly. He was warm. He was safe. Abigail was not. She was terrified. Harrison had ridden into town at sunrise. He had to speak to the sheriff. He had to report the poisoned cattle. He had to look Bartholomew Higgins in the eye and let the town know the Vance Ranch was not broken. He should have been back by supper. Abigail stood up. She walked to the window. She scraped a small circle through the condensation on the glass. She looked out into the pitch-black night. Nothing, just rain and darkness. She walked back to the fire. She threw another log on the grate. She checked the kettle. The water was still boiling. She had kept it boiling for 4 hours, just in case. Out on the frontier, a late rider usually meant a dead rider. Then the dog started barking. It was a frantic, sharp sound coming from the barn. Abigail froze. She turned toward the heavy timber door. She held her breath. A heavy thud hit the wood, then another. It sounded like a sack of grain being dropped against the pine boards. Someone fumbled with the iron latch from the outside. The metal clicked. The heavy door swung inward. A gust of freezing, wet wind blew into the cabin. It made the oil lamps flicker and dance. Harrison fell through the doorway. He didn't walk. He collapsed. He hit the rough floorboards hard, catching himself on his hands and knees. He was breathing in ragged, shallow gasps. His heavy canvas coat was soaked black with rain and with blood. Abigail didn't scream. Panic was a luxury she could not afford. She rushed forward. She grabbed his arm. It was like trying to lift a fallen tree. "Harrison," she said. Her voice was tight. "Look at me." "Can you stand?" he grunted. He didn't look up. Blood dripped from his chin onto the floor. "Allie," he choked out. The word tasted like copper. Behind the saloon, 4 of them. He had walked into a trap. Bart Higgins didn't fight fair. He desperate men with cheap whiskey and set them loose in the dark. Abigail hooked her arms under his armpits. She planted her feet. She pulled with everything she had. "Get up," she commanded. "You are not dying on this floor. Get up." Harrison groaned. He pushed off the ground with one massive shaking arm. Together, they stumbled toward the wooden table in the center of the room. He hit the edge of the table and slumped forward. He draped his upper body over the rough wood, his face turned sideways, gasping for air. Abigail didn't waste a second. She grabbed a heavy pair of iron shears from her sewing kit. She stepped behind him. "I have to cut the coat," she said. "Do it," he breathed. She slid the cold iron beneath the heavy canvas at his waist. She squeezed the handles. The thick fabric resisted, but she forced the blades through. She cut straight up the center of his back. She sliced through the coat. She sliced through the wool shirt underneath. She peeled the ruined fabric away from his skin. She gasped. She couldn't help it. The wound was massive. It was a jagged knife slash. It started at his left shoulder blade and tore diagonally down to his lower ribs on the right side. It was deep. The edges of the flesh were raw and pulled apart. Dark red blood pulsed out in a steady, terrifying rhythm. It wasn't a clean cut. The knife had been dull. It had torn the muscle. Abigail turned away for exactly 1 second. She closed her eyes. She took a deep breath. She locked her fear in a small, dark box inside her mind. She opened her eyes. She went to work. She grabbed a stack of clean linen towels. She pressed them hard against the wound. "Press down," she ordered him. "Keep the pressure." Harrison reached a heavy, trembling hand back. He pressed his palm against the towels. He let out a low hiss through his teeth. Abigail ran to the stove. She grabbed the boiling kettle. She poured the scalding water into a tin basin. She grabbed a bottle of brown whiskey from the top shelf. She grabbed her sewing kit. A curved iron needle. Thick black silk thread. She brought everything to the table. She struck a match and lit a second oil lamp. She set it right beside him. The yellow light cast harsh, deep shadows across his pale, sweating face. She pulled the soaked towels away. The bleeding had slowed, but it hadn't stopped. "This is going to burn," Abigail said. Her voice was steady, completely calm. She uncorked the whiskey. She didn't offer him a drink. She poured the harsh liquor directly into the open, gaping wound. Harrison roared. It was a deafening animal sound. His massive hands gripped the edges of the thick timber table. His knuckles turned bone white. The wood groaned under his grip, his back arched in pure agony. Every muscle in his body pulled tight like a coiled spring. "Breathe," Abigail said. She wiped the blood away with a clean, hot rag. "Just breathe." She picked up the curved needle. She threaded the black silk. "I have to sew it shut. Now," she said. "If I don't, you will bleed to death before sunrise. Hold still." Harrison buried his face against the tabletop. He nodded once. Abigail pinched the raw, open edges of his flesh together. Her fingers were slick with his blood. She pushed the iron needle through his skin. It was brutal work. Human skin is tough. It takes force to pierce it. She pulled the black thread tight. She tied a knot. She moved an inch down. She pushed the needle through again. 1 stitch. 2. 3. Harrison was shaking violently. Sweat poured down his face, pooling on the table. He didn't scream again. He just took it. He ground his teeth together so hard Abigail thought they might shatter. 4 stitches. 5. 6. The cabin was silent, except for the driving rain outside, and Harrison as ragged, wet breathing inside. The air smelled of cheap whiskey, old iron, and hot blood. It took 22 stitches to close the terrible gash. When Abigail tied the final knot, her own hands were cramping. Her dress was ruined, soaked dark red at the waist. She cut the thread. She dropped the bloody shears onto the table with a heavy clatter. "It's done," she whispered. She took a clean towel. She dipped it in the warm water. Very gently, she began to wash the dried blood off his broad shoulders. She washed the sweat from the back of his neck. Her touch was soft. It was a stark contrast to the violence she had just performed. And that soft touch is what finally broke him. Harrison Vance, the terror of the territory, the man made of iron and ice, suddenly let out a sound that chilled Abigail to her core. It wasn't a roar of pain. It was a sob. It started deep in his chest, a heavy, broken heave, then another, and another. He didn't lift his head from the table. His massive shoulders shook uncontrollably. The tears mixed with the sweat and the blood on his face. The physical pain had broken the dam. But the agony pouring out of him now had nothing to do with a knife. The smell of the blood, the smell of the whiskey, the yellow light of the oil lamp, the feeling of a woman desperately fighting to keep him alive. It pulled him backward, back through time, back to a different cabin, back to a different storm. "I couldn't stop it," Harrison choked out. His voice was muffled against the wood. It sounded like a dying man making a final confession. "I couldn't stop the bleeding." Abigail stopped washing his back. She stood perfectly still. 10 years, Harrison wept. The words tore out of his throat, raw and bleeding. The fever took her. Then the bleeding started. I had my hands on her. I tried to hold it back. I couldn't. I just watched them die. My wife, my baby. I just watched them bleed away in my hands. He clenched his fists. He beat them weakly against the tabletop. I'm so tired, he sobbed. I'm so goddamn tired of the dark. He was entirely exposed. The hardened rancher was gone. He was just a broken man, stripped bare, bleeding out a decade of frozen, unacknowledged grief. He had locked his heart away to survive the frontier, believing that feeling nothing was the only way to avoid feeling pain. But the pain had never left. It had just been waiting. Abigail didn't say a word. She didn't offer empty platitudes. She didn't tell him it was going to be all right. She walked around the table. She stood beside him. She reached down. She put her arms around his massive, shaking shoulders. Harrison flinched for a second. Then he surrendered. He slid off the edge of the table, dropping heavily to his knees on the wooden floor. He wrapped his thick, bruised arms around her waist. He buried his face in her stomach. He wept. He wept with the absolute, terrifying abandonment of a man who has held his breath for 10 years and is finally forced to exhale. Abigail held him. She sank down to her knees, right there, on the blood-stained floorboards, pulling him with her. She cradled his large, heavy head against her chest. She wrapped her arms securely around his neck. She rested her chin on the top of his head. She ran her fingers through his dark, sweat-soaked hair. She held him tight, anchoring him to the earth, while the storm inside him raged. This was not a kiss. It was not romance. This was something far deeper. It was two wounded animals in the dark, recognizing the scars on each other's souls. It was the purest form of intimacy the frontier could offer. They stayed like that for a long time. The rain outside began to slow. The heavy downpour turned into a soft, steady drizzle. Harrison's sobs finally quieted. His breathing slowed. He was exhausted, completely emptied out. But he didn't pull away. He kept his face pressed against her, afraid that if he let go, the ice would return. Abigail kept her arms wrapped tightly around him. She looked at the dying fire. She looked at the shadows on the wall. She knew what she had to do. She had to seal the crack he had just opened, not with ice, but with truth. She shifted slightly. She pulled back just enough to look down at his face. His eyes were red. His face was hollow. He looked up at her, waiting for the judgment, waiting for the disgust. Men in the West did not cry. Abigail didn't judge him. She held his gaze. Her eyes were fierce. She took a breath. She spoke clearly. Her voice rang out in the quiet cabin, deliberate and uncompromising. "Listen to me, Harrison," Abigail said. Her tone was a gentle command. "Running from your pain is true cowardice. You have hidden out here for a decade, building walls out of anger and silence. You think these tears make you weak. You think crying diminishes your worth as a man in this harsh country. It does not. Not for a second. Tears are simply proof. They are proof that after all the death and all the cruelty, you still have a heart capable of feeling pain and capable of giving love. A man who cannot weep for what he has lost is a man who has lost his humanity. Let it out. You are safe here." Harrison stared at her. He heard every word. The words sank deep into the raw, aching spaces inside his chest. They didn't just comfort him. They absolved him. She wasn't asking him to be strong. She was asking him to be human. He closed his eyes. He let out a long, shuddering sigh. The tension, the decades of rigid, unforgiving tension, slowly bled out of his muscles. He let his head rest fully against her chest again. He listened to the steady, rhythmic beating of her heart. It was a strong heart, a heart that had known its own profound grief and had chosen to keep beating anyway. "I've got you," Abigail whispered into the dark. She stroked his hair. "I've got you." The oil lamp flickered on the table, casting a warm, golden circle around them. Outside, the storm had finally passed. The wind died down, and for the first time in a very long time, the Vance cabin did not feel like a fortress. It felt, just for a moment, like a home. The morning air was different. The bitter sting of winter was finally gone. A warm southern breeze blew through the valley. It smelled of wet pine needles and fresh dirt. The meadow grass was turning a bright, blinding green. Inside the cabin, the heavy silence of the past months had broken. Harrison sat at the rough timber table. He was drinking his coffee. He was watching the floor. Samuel was crawling. The baby had figured it out 2 days ago. Now, he was a menace. He dragged his little knees across the braided rug. He reached for the iron fireplace tools. Abigail was at the stove. She was flipping flapjacks in the heavy iron skillet. She turned her head. She saw Samuel reaching for the ash bucket. "Harrison," she warned, pointing with the wooden spatula. Harrison put his coffee down. He didn't sigh. He didn't grumble. He stood up, walked over, and scooped the boy off the floor with one massive hand. Samuel squealed. He grabbed a fistful of Harrison S.'s dark shirt. Harrison held the boy up. He looked at the baby S. wide, laughing eyes. A slow, genuine smile broke across Harrison S.'s weathered face. It changed his entire appearance. The terrifying rancher was gone. He looked younger. He looked alive. Abigail watched them. Her chest felt warm. They had built something out of the ice and the blood. They had built a family. Then the dogs started to bark. It wasn't a warning bark. It was a frantic, aggressive alarm. Harrison's smile vanished. His eyes went hard. He handed the boy to Abigail. He walked straight to the corner and picked up his Winchester rifle. He checked the action. He opened the heavy front door and stepped onto the porch. Abigail stood behind him, looking over his broad shoulder. A wagon was coming up the muddy trail. It was followed by 3 men on horseback. Sheriff Miller was riding in the front. Bartholomew Higgins rode right beside him. Bart wore a new wool suit and a smug, satisfied grin. In the wagon, sitting next to the driver, was a young woman. She was pale. She was shaking. She looked no older than 19. She clutched a small cloth bag in her lap. The group pulled to a stop right at the fence line. "Morning, Vance," Sheriff Miller called out. His voice was tired. He looked away from Harrison's hard stare. "Get off my land, Higgins," Harrison said. His voice was low. "Dangerous," Bart chuckled. He tipped his bowler hat. "I'm just a concerned citizen today, Vance. Just helping the law do its job." Sheriff Miller pulled a folded piece of heavy parchment from his coat. It had a red wax seal, a judge's seal. "I have a warrant, Harrison," the sheriff said. He unrolled the paper. "Sworn out by Judge Lawson in town." "For what?" Harrison asked. His grip tightened on the rifle. "Kidnapping," the sheriff read. "Theft of a child, and harboring a fugitive from a legal debt." The words hung in the warm morning air. They felt heavier than an anvil. Abigail stepped out onto the porch. She clutched Samuel tight against her chest. "That is a lie. You gave him the boy, Sheriff. You forced him." The sheriff looked at the ground. "Papers say different now, Mrs. Foster. The biological mother has come forward." He pointed to the young woman in the wagon, Mary. The girl looked up. Her eyes were red from crying. She looked terrified. She looked from Bart to the sheriff to the baby in Abigail's arms. She let out a small, broken sob. "She says the ranch hand didn't abandon the boy," Bart said, stepping his horse forward. "She says she left the boy at the saloon for 5 minutes to fetch a doctor. And when she came back, you had stolen him, Vance. You and the widow. That is a damn lie, Harrison roared. He raised the rifle an inch. The 3 hired guns behind Bart instantly drew their revolvers. The click of the hammers sounded loud as thunder. Careful, Vance, Bart smiled. You fire that rifle, you hang. It's the law. Harrison didn't care. His blood was boiling. He had fought the winter. He had fought the poison. He was not going to let this greasy loan shark take his life away. He raised the stock of the rifle to his shoulder. Harrison, don't! Abigail's voice was sharp. It cut through his rage. She put her hand on his rifle barrel. She pushed it down. She stepped in front of him. She looked at the sheriff. She looked at Bart. She looked at the young, terrified mother in the wagon. Abigail's mind raced. She saw the trap. It was perfectly laid. Bart owned the judge. He owned the sheriff. If Harrison fought, they would shoot him dead. They would claim it was self-defense against a kidnapper. Bart would take the ranch. He would dam the water. If Harrison surrendered, he would go to jail. He would hang, and Bart would still take the ranch. There was only one piece on the board that could change the game. Abigail took a deep breath. She felt her heart shatter into 1,000 pieces, but her face remained perfectly calm. Sheriff Miller, Abigail called out. Her voice was steady and loud. Mr. Vance did not kidnap this child. He didn't want the boy. He didn't want me. Harrison looked down at her, his brow furrowed in confusion. Abby, stop. She didn't look at him. She couldn't. If she looked at him, she would lose her nerve. I forced him, Abigail lied. The words tasted like ash. I had a gun. I hid it under my coat that night in the saloon. I held it to his ribs in the wagon. I made him bring us here. I made him keep us. He is innocent. He is a victim. Abigail, what the hell are you doing? Harrison grabbed her arm. His voice broke. She pulled her arm away. She walked down the wooden steps. She walked through the mud, right up to the wagon. She looked up at Mary. The young girl was trembling. Abigail looked down at Samuel. The baby cooed. He reached up and touched Abigail's cheek with a tiny, warm hand. A tear broke free and rolled down Abigail's face. She kissed his small forehead. She breathed in the smell of him one last time. Then she held the baby out. Mary reached down. She took the boy. She clutched him to her chest and began to sob uncontrollably. Abigail took a step back. She looked up at Sheriff Miller. She didn't look defeated. She looked furious. She looked like a judge reading a final sentence. The law is meant to be a shield for the innocent, Sheriff, Abigail said. Her voice rang out, clear and sharp. Every man heard it. When you allow wealthy men to use it as a sword to bleed the poor, you aren't keeping the peace. You are just wearing a badge to do a criminal's dirty work. A society that lets money buy the truth is already dead. You have traded your honor for a few silver coins. The sheriff flushed red. He looked away again. He couldn't meet her eyes. Bart Higgins simply laughed. A pretty speech, widow. Now, pack your bags. You are coming with me. Your debt is waiting. I will be ready in 5 minutes, Abigail said. She turned around. She walked back up the porch steps. Harrison stood there. He looked like a man who had just been shot in the chest. His hands were shaking. The rifle hung loosely at his side. Why? Harrison whispered. His voice was completely hollow. Why did you say that? Abigail walked past him into the cabin. She grabbed her worn cloth coat. She grabbed a small burlap sack. They have the judge, Harrison, she whispered back. She didn't have time to cry. They have the warrant. If you fight, you die. If you die, I lose everything anyway. I don't care about the ranch, Harrison said desperately. He stepped toward her. He reached for her. I don't care about the land. Let them take it. We can leave. Together. Abigail stopped. She looked up into his eyes. The ice was gone. There was only raw, bleeding love left in them. She reached up. She placed her calloused hand against his rough cheek. "You are a good man, Harrison Vance," she said softly. "You saved me. Now it is my turn to save you. Do not follow me today. Promise me." "I can't do that," he said. A tear spilled over his eyelid. The mountain was crumbling. "You must," she said fiercely. "If you come into town today with a gun, they will hang you. Stay here. Let me fix this." She pulled away. She walked out the door. She didn't look back. She climbed into the back of Bart's wagon. She sat on the hard wooden planks. She kept her eyes fixed on the horizon. Bart tipped his hat to Harrison. He snapped the reins. The wagon rolled away. The horses churned the mud. Harrison stood on the porch. He watched them go. He watched the wagon disappear over the ridge. The dogs stopped barking. The breeze died down. The cabin was silent again. The deafening, crushing silence of the past had returned. But this time, it was infinitely worse. Because this time, Harrison knew exactly what he had lost. The town was ugly at night. It didn't have the rugged beauty of the open range. It smelled of cheap coal smoke, stale beer, and unwashed bodies. The mud in the streets was churned into a thick, foul-smelling paste. Abigail sat on a narrow cot in a small, dark room. It was above the Red Dog's saloon. It was a prison. Bart Higgins had locked the door from the outside. He told her she started work tomorrow evening. He told her she belonged to the house now. Abigail sat perfectly still in the dark. She did not cry. Crying wasted energy. Crying clouded the mind. Harrison Vance would have fought his way out with a gun. He would have broken down the door and shot every man in the building. But Abigail was not a 6-foot-tall rancher. She was a woman, and women on the frontier fought differently. They fought with patience. They fought with their minds. She knew Bartholomew Higgins. She knew men like him. Their power wasn't in their fists. Their power was in their paper. Deeds, contracts, ledgers, blackmail. A man who owned the judge and the sheriff didn't do it with a handshake. He did it with a record. He kept a tally. Higgins was a greedy man, and greedy men always count their money. If she could find the ledger, she could break him. She stood up. She walked to the small, dirty window. It looked out over the back alley. It was a 2-story drop into the mud. Abigail opened the window. The latch was rusted, but it gave way. The cold night air hit her face. She looked down. There was a stack of empty whiskey barrels pushed against the side of the building. It was a risk. A broken leg out here was a death sentence. She didn't hesitate. She swung her legs over the windowsill. She grabbed the rough wooden frame. She lowered herself until she was hanging by her fingertips. She let go. She fell fast. She hit the top of the whiskey barrels. The wood groaned loudly. She tumbled backward, landing hard in the freezing alley mud. The breath was knocked right out of her lungs. She lay there for a second, gasping, staring up at the cloudy night sky. Nothing broke. She was bruised, but she was whole. She scrambled to her feet. She wiped the mud from her face. She didn't run away from the saloon. She crept toward it. She moved through the shadows like a ghost. She reached the back door. It was heavy oak, bound in iron. Locked, she crouched down. She felt along the bottom edge of the doorframe. She remembered the bartender. He was lazy. He hated waking up early to let the delivery men in. Her fingers brushed against cold metal. A spare iron key, hidden under a loose floorboard on the back stoop. She slid the key into the lock. She turned it slowly. It clicked. She slipped inside. The back hallway was dark. It smelled of sour mash and cigar ash. She could hear the piano playing faintly from the front barroom. Men were shouting and laughing. She crept down the hall. She found the door with the brass plate. Manager. She turned the glass knob. It was unlocked. Bart was arrogant. He didn't think anyone in this town had the spine to steal from him. She slipped into the office and closed the door silently behind her. It was completely dark. She couldn't light a lamp. The light would show under the door. She dropped to her hands and knees. She crawled toward the massive oak desk. She felt the drawers. Locked. All of them. She sat back on her heels. She thought about Bart. Where would a paranoid, greedy man hide his lifeblood? Not in a desk that any drunken thief could pry open. She looked at the floor. The office had a beautiful, expensive Persian rug, out of place in a frontier town. She crawled to the corner of the rug. She pulled it back. The floorboards underneath were solid. She crawled to the other side. She pulled the rug back. One of the pine boards was slightly higher than the rest. The nail head was loose. She reached into her pocket. She pulled out the curved iron sewing needle she had used to stitch Harrison S. back. She wedged the thick iron needle under the wood. She pried it upward. The board popped loose. She reached into the dark hole. Her fingers brushed against smooth, heavy leather. She pulled it out. It was a thick, black ledger book. She stood up. She carried the book to the window. The moonlight cut through the dirty glass, just enough for her to see the pages. She squinted at the neat, sharp handwriting. There it was. May 2nd, payment to Judge Lawson, $50. Ruling on the water rights, May 10th, to Sheriff Miller, $20. Ignoring the cattle poisoning. May 14th, payment to Mary, $10. False testimony against Vance. It was a confession in ink. It was the rope that would hang Bart Higgins. Abigail tucked the heavy book into the waistband of her skirt. She pulled her coat tight over it. She slipped back out the door, locked it, and put the key back under the floorboard. She was back in the cold alley. She had the weapon. But a weapon is useless without a soldier to wield it. If she took this to the sheriff, he would just burn it. If she took it to the U.S. Marshal in the next county, it would take a week. Harrison would be dead by then. She needed a witness. She needed someone the town would believe. She looked down the street, toward the boarding house. She walked quickly, keeping to the shadows. She reached the boarding house. She slipped through the unlocked front door. She crept up the creaking wooden stairs. She knew which room Bart rented for his guests. Room 4. She tried the knob. It turned. She stepped inside. The room was small. A single oil lamp burned low on the bedside table. Mary was sitting on the edge of the bed. She was rocking Samuel. The baby was crying softly. Mary looked exhausted. She looked entirely broken. Mary looked up. She gasped. She pulled the baby tight against her chest, her eyes wide with terror. "Please," Mary whispered, tears instantly filling her eyes. "Please don't hurt me. Don't take him back. Mr. Higgins said you were a criminal." Abigail didn't move closer. She stayed by the door. She kept her hands open and empty by her sides. "I am not a criminal, Mary," Abigail said. Her voice was incredibly soft. It was the voice of a mother. "And I am not here to take your son." Mary blinked. The tears spilled over. "You aren't?" "No," Abigail said. "He is your son. You carried him. You birthed him. He belongs with you." "Always," Mary let out a shuddering breath. She buried her face in the baby's thin blanket. "I didn't want to leave him. I swear to God. I was so hungry. The father ran off. I didn't have a cent. I thought someone rich at the saloon would take him. Give him a better life." "I know," Abigail said. She walked slowly to the bed. She sat down next to the young girl. Mr. Higgins found me, Mary cried. He gave me money. He told me if I didn't say the rancher stole the baby, he would have me arrested for abandonment. They hang women for that. I was so scared. Abigail reached out. She gently placed her rough, calloused hands over Mary S., small, trembling ones. She looked deep into the young girl's eyes. She needed Mary to hear this. She needed her to believe it in her bones. Listen to me, Abigail said. Her voice was firm, carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. We are women, Mary. We are not tools to be exploited by men like Bart Higgins. We are not weak, and we are not helpless. You have the right to be a mother with dignity. You have the right to stand up and protect your child instead of living as a puppet to an abuser. True freedom doesn't come from hiding behind a cruel man. It comes from standing together and speaking the truth. Mary looked up. Her lip trembled. But he has the sheriff. He has the judge. He will crush us. Abigail reached inside her coat. She pulled out the heavy black ledger. She dropped it onto the bed mattress with a heavy thud. He doesn't have anything anymore, Abigail said. This book proves every bribe, every lie. It proves he paid you to lie. It proves he paid the judge to steal the ranch. Mary stared at the book. What do you want me to do? Tomorrow morning, the circuit judge rides into town for the monthly court session, Abigail said. He is an honest man, a federal man, not one of Bart S. paid dogs. I am going to stand in the middle of the town square. I am going to hand him this book, but I need you to stand next to me. I need you to tell him the truth. Mary looked at the baby in her arms. She looked at the dark window. She looked at Abigail. She saw the raw strength in the older woman's face. She saw a woman who had lost everything but refused to be broken. Mary took a deep breath. She wiped her eyes. She sat up a little straighter. Okay, Mary whispered. Her voice shook, but she nodded. Okay, I'll do it. I'll stand with you. Abigail smiled. It was a fierce, proud smile. The night was still dark. The mud was still deep. But as Abigail sat in that small room, she knew the tide had turned. She had found the poison. Now, it was time to cure the town. The town courthouse was boiling. It was a small, square building made of rough pine. It had no windows on the ground floor. It smelled of chewing tobacco, unwashed bodies, and nervous sweat. The room was packed tight. Half the town had come to see the great Harrison Vance finally fall. Harrison stood at the front. His wrists were bound in heavy iron chains. His face was a mask of stone. He looked straight ahead. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at Sheriff Miller. He didn't look at Bart Higgins, who was sitting in the front row, wearing a new silk tie and a cruel, easy smile. Harrison felt empty. The ice had returned to his chest, but it offered no comfort this time. He was just waiting for the rope. He was waiting for the dark. At the high wooden desk sat Judge Caldwell. He was a federal circuit judge, an old man from back east. He wore spectacles and a heavy black robe. He didn't belong to Bart Higgins. He belonged to the law, but the law only knew what was put on paper. And Bart S. paper was perfect. Harrison Vance, Judge Caldwell said. His voice was dry, like dead leaves. You are charged with the abduction of an infant. You are charged with harboring a debtor. Sheriff Miller has sworn the affidavit. A witness has come forward. How do you plead? Harrison opened his mouth. He was going to say guilty. He was going to end it. The heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom slammed open. The sound cracked like a rifle shot. The entire crowd turned. Abigail Foster stood in the doorway. She did not look like a broken widow. She did not look like a saloon girl. She stood tall. Her chin was up. Her eyes burned with a cold, fierce fire. And standing right beside her, trembling but holding her ground, was Mary. The baby, Samuel, was wrapped tightly in a blanket against Mary S.'s chest. Bart Higgins jumped out of his chair. His smile vanished. "What is this?" "Sheriff, arrest that woman. She belongs to me." "Sit down, Mr. Higgins," Judge Caldwell barked. He slammed his wooden gavel. "This is a federal court, not your personal tavern. Madam, who are you, and why are you interrupting my proceedings?" Abigail walked down the center aisle. The crowd parted for her. She walked straight to the Judge S. bench. She didn't look at Bart. She only looked briefly at Harrison. For a second, the stone mask on his face cracked. He let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. Abigail reached into her coat. She pulled out the heavy black leather ledger. She slammed it down onto the judge's desk. The dust flew up. "My name is Abigail Foster," she said. Her voice carried to the back of the room, "and I am here to present evidence. That book contains the true record of this town. It is a ledger kept by Bartholomew Higgins. It details every bribe he has paid to Sheriff Miller, every dollar he paid to a corrupt local judge to steal water rights. And, Your Honor, it details exactly how much he paid this young mother to commit perjury." The courtroom erupted. Men shouted. The sheriff took a step backward toward the side door. Judge Caldwell hammered his gavel until the handle nearly snapped. "Order! I will have order!" He picked up the ledger. He adjusted his spectacles. He flipped to the marked page. His eyes scanned the ink. His face turned a deep, angry red. He looked over his glasses at Mary. "Young woman, step forward." Mary walked up. She was crying, but she held the baby tight. "Did this man pay you to lie?" the judge asked. His voice was surprisingly gentle. "Did Harrison Vance steal your child?" Mary shook her head. "No, sir. I left him. I was starving. I left him at the saloon, Mr. Higgins found me yesterday. He gave me $10. He told me if I didn't blame Mr. Vance, he would have me hanged for abandoning a baby. I was so scared." Judge Caldwell closed the book. The sound was like a coffin slamming shut. He looked at Sheriff Miller. The sheriff was sweating through his uniform. He looked at Bart Higgins. Bart was looking around, calculating the distance to the door. "Bailiff," Judge Caldwell said, "unchain Mr. Vance, and put those irons on Mr. Higgins and the sheriff. They will be taking the noon stagecoach to the federal penitentiary in Cheyenne." It was over in 5 minutes. The deputies grabbed Bart. He fought. He cursed, but they dragged him away. The sheriff handed over his badge without a word. Harrison stood in the center of the room. The heavy iron chains fell from his wrists with a loud clatter. He rubbed his bruised skin. He couldn't believe it. The crushing weight was gone. He was free. He still had his ranch. He still had his life. He turned around. He looked for Abigail. She was already walking out the door. Harrison pushed through the stunned crowd. He burst out the front doors of the courthouse. The morning sun was blinding. He blinked against the light. He saw her walking fast down the boardwalk, heading toward the edge of town, heading toward the open prairie. "Abby," he called out. His long legs ate up the distance. He caught up to her at the end of the wooden walkway, right where the town dirt met the tall, green prairie grass. He grabbed her arm gently. He turned her around. "You did it," Harrison breathed. He was almost laughing. The relief was overwhelming. "You beat him. You saved the ranch. You saved me." Abigail looked at him. She didn't smile. Her eyes were deeply sad. "I did," she said softly. "You are free, Harrison?" Harrison frowned. The joy faded from his face. He looked at her closely. He saw the pain hiding behind her strong posture. "What's wrong?" he asked. "It's over. We can go home." Abigail shook her head. She pulled her arm away. She took a step back into the tall grass. The wind whipped her skirt around her ankles. "I can't go back with you, Harrison," she said. "Why?" Harrison demanded. Panic flared in his chest, a different kind of panic. "Bart is gone. The debt is gone. Why did you walk away yesterday? Why did you give Samuel back to Mary without a fight?" Abigail looked away. She looked out at the rolling green hills. "Because I had to," she whispered. "You love that boy," Harrison said. His voice was thick with emotion. "You love him like your own flesh and blood. I saw you. You fought for him. You fought for me. Why surrender him to a girl who gave him away?" Abigail turned back. Tears were finally spilling down her cheeks. The iron wall she had built around her heart finally shattered. "Because she is his mother, Harrison," Abigail cried. Her voice broke. "Because she shares his blood. Because she has a body that can give him life and can give him brothers and sisters. And I do not." Harrison stood frozen. He didn't understand. Abigail wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. She stood tall, refusing to hide her shame anymore. "When I was married before," Abigail said, her voice dropping to a harsh, painful whisper, "I fell ill. A terrible fever. The town doctor had to cut me open to save my life. He saved me. But he took everything else. My womb is ruined, Harrison. I am permanently barren. I can never carry a child. I can never be a biological mother." She looked at the ground. She couldn't meet his eyes. "I love Samuel more than my own breathing," she continued, sobbing quietly now. "But Mary's bond is sacred. I gave him back because I know the agony of an empty cradle. I could not be the woman who stole another mother's child, just to fill the hollow space inside myself." She took a deep, shaking breath. She finally looked up into Harrison's eyes. "And I cannot go back to the ranch with you," she said. "You lost your wife. You lost your baby. You have built a good life. You deserve a real family. Harrison, you deserve a woman who can give you sons to work that land. You deserve a legacy. I can never give you that. I am a broken thing." She turned around. She started to walk away into the sea of green grass. Harrison didn't let her take a third step. He moved faster than a striking snake. He closed the distance. He grabbed her shoulders. He spun her back around. Before she could speak, before she could pull away, Harrison dropped straight down into the dirt. He fell to his knees right in front of her. He didn't care who in town saw them. He didn't care about his pride. He reached out and took both of her small, calloused hands in his massive ones. He pressed her hands tight against his lips. He kissed her scarred knuckles. Abigail gasped, "Harrison, get up." "What are you doing?" Harrison looked up at her. His iron gray eyes were bright with tears, but they were completely clear. There was no hesitation. There was no doubt. He spoke, and he made sure his words carried the weight of a solemn vow. "I am not letting you walk away," Harrison said. His voice rumbled deep in his chest. "Listen to me, Abigail. I do not need a woman to bear my children. I do not need an heir to work my land. I need a life partner. I need you. Bloodlines are merely an accident of birth. They don't make you loyal. They don't make you brave. A true family is not defined by biology. A true family is built by strangers who freely choose to bond, who understand each other's pain, and who respect one another as equals. You are not a broken thing. You are the strongest, most whole woman I have ever known. Let me be your family." Abigail stared down at him. The wind blew her hair across her face. The words washed over her. They didn't just heal the wound of the past few days. They reached deep down and healed a wound she had carried for years. He didn't pity her. He revered her. She fell to her knees in the dirt, right in front of him. She wrapped her arms around his thick neck. He crushed her against his chest. He buried his face in her hair. They held each other in the tall grass, two survivors of the frontier, finally finding a safe place to land. The winter was truly over. The ice was gone. "Take me home, Harrison," she whispered against his collar. "Let's go home." 2 months later, the Vance Ranch looked nothing like a fortress. The heavy iron chain was gone from the front gate. The wooden shutters were thrown wide open, letting the warm summer sun pour into the cabin. The smell of dust and loneliness had been permanently scrubbed away. It was replaced by the smell of roasting beef, sweet apple pie, and blooming wild lavender. The great barn had been swept completely clean. The hay was stacked high to make room. Long wooden tables were set up down the center aisle. They were covered in white linen and dotted with glass jars full of yellow prairie daisies. It was a wedding day. Harrison stood at the front of the barn. He wore a brand new suit of dark blue wool. His hair was slicked back. His beard was neatly trimmed. He looked terrifyingly handsome. He also looked like he might faint. He kept shifting his weight from one boot to the other. Beside him stood Sheriff Miller. Not the corrupt man from before, but the new sheriff. A good man appointed by the federal judge. Behind Harrison stood half the town. They hadn't come out of fear. They had come out of profound respect. The story of what Abigail and Harrison had done, saving the cattle, taking down Bart Higgins, forgiving the town, had spread like a prairie fire. The town felt a deep, collective shame for how they had treated them. They brought pies. They brought hand-carved chairs. They brought silent apologies. At the front of the crowd stood Mary. She wore a clean, pale blue dress. She looked healthy. The fear was gone from her eyes. She held little Samuel on her hip. The baby was chubby and laughing, chewing on a wooden teething ring. Mary wasn't a guest. She was the new estate manager of the Vance Ranch. Harrison and Abigail had hired her the day after the trial. They paid her a fair, generous wage. They gave her the large spare room in the newly built bunkhouse. She managed the kitchen. She managed the accounts. And Samuel grew up surrounded by his biological mother and the two people who loved him like their own. The fiddle player in the corner started a slow, sweet tune. Harrison stopped shifting. He froze. He looked toward the open barn doors. Abigail walked in. She didn't wear an expensive silk gown imported from Paris. She wore a simple dress of bright, crisp white cotton. It was practical. It was beautiful. Her dark hair was pinned up, woven with small yellow wildflowers. She walked down the dirt aisle. She didn't look at the crowd. She only looked at Harrison. Harrison felt his breath catch in his throat. He remembered the starving, freezing widow standing in the blizzard outside the saloon. He looked at the radiant, unbroken woman walking toward him now. She reached him. She put her calloused hands in his. The judge spoke the words. They exchanged plain gold bands. They didn't need grand vows. Their vows had been written in the mud, in the blood, and in the quiet nights by the fire. Harrison leaned down. He kissed her. It was gentle. It was a promise of absolute safety. The barn erupted in cheers. The fiddle player launched into a fast, joyful jig. The party lasted long into the night. There was dancing. There was laughter. For the first time in a decade, Harrison Vance smiled until his face hurt. He danced with his wife. He danced with Mary. He even let the town blacksmith slap him on the shoulder without breaking the man's arm. It was a perfect beginning. Time on the frontier moves fast. The harsh seasons force life to grow quickly or die trying. 5 years passed. It was the peak of summer, 1883. The morning sun rose over the jagged peaks of the Wyoming mountains, casting a golden light across the sprawling valley. The Vance Ranch had transformed. It was no longer just a cattle operation. It was a sanctuary. Down by the creek, 3 new bunkhouses stood in a neat row. They were painted white. They housed widows who had lost their husbands to the mines. They housed old, broken-down ranch hands who had nowhere else to go. Abigail and Harrison had built a community. Everyone worked. Everyone pulled their weight. But no one was ever turned away in the snow. No one was ever asked to trade their dignity for a meal. They paid fair wages. They offered a safe roof. Harrison was in the front yard. He was 47 years old now. There was a little more silver in his dark hair. The harsh lines around his eyes had softened into deep laugh lines. He was down on his hands and knees in the dirt. On his broad back sat a 5-year-old boy. Samuel was a wild thing. He had a mop of curly brown hair and a face covered in dirt and berry juice. He was holding on to Harrison's shirt collar like reins. "Faster, Pa! Faster!" Samuel yelled, kicking his little boots against Harrison's ribs. Harrison let out a loud, rumbling growl. He crawled faster through the grass, bucking slightly. "Hold on, cowboy. The Mustang is breaking." Samuel shrieked with pure joy. Abigail stood on the wide wraparound porch. She held a steaming mug of coffee. She watched her husband playing in the dirt with the boy he once refused to touch. She watched Mary walk out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron, smiling at the sight of her son riding the giant rancher. Abigail, as heart swelled, it was full, it was overflowing. The pain of her past, the hollow ache of the children she could never have, had not vanished entirely. It was a scar, but it no longer hurt, because she had found a different way to be a mother. She had mothered this land. She had mothered these broken people. She had mothered the man she loved. Evening came. The sun dipped behind the mountains, painting the sky in violent streaks of purple and gold. The ranch settled into a quiet, peaceful rhythm. The cattle were bedded down. The workers were in the mess hall. Samuel was asleep in his bed, Mary reading a book beside him. Harrison and Abigail sat alone at the heavy timber table in their cabin. The fireplace was dark for the summer. An oil lamp burned brightly on the wood. Harrison was cleaning his reading glasses. Abigail was writing. She had a thick, leather-bound journal open in front of her. She held a steel-nibbed pen. She dipped it into a glass inkwell. The scratch of the metal on the heavy paper was the only sound in the room. She was documenting their lives. She was writing down the recipes for her herbal remedies. She was writing down the history of the ranch. She wanted Samuel to have it when he grew up. She wanted him to know the truth about where he came from and the people who chose him. Harrison watched her hand move across the page. He reached across the table. He rested his large hand gently over hers, stopping her pen. "What are you writing tonight?" he asked softly. Abigail looked up. She smiled. She turned her hand over and squeezed his fingers. "I am writing the end of the story," she said. "The story of our first winter." Harrison nodded slowly. "It was a hard winter." "It was the best winter," she corrected him. She pulled her hand back gently. She looked down at the fresh ink on the page. She took a deep breath. She didn't just want to write it. She wanted to say it out loud. She wanted the words to live in the air between them. She looked at her husband. She spoke clearly, her voice ringing with absolute certainty. She delivered the lesson that the frontier had carved into her soul. "The Wild West of 1878 taught me a terrible and beautiful lesson," Abigail said, reading the words she had just written from her heart. "It taught me that while a gun can easily end a life, only a profound respect for human dignity can save a soul. We survived because we refuse to treat each other like animals. The compassion we show to one another, the grace we extend to the broken, is the truest gold mine in this territory, and we never have to dig into the cold earth to find it. It is right here, in our hands. Harrison listened. He felt the truth of her words settle deep in his bones. He didn't need to say anything back. He just stood up, walked around the table. He pulled her up from the chair. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close to his chest. They stood together in the warm glow of the lamplight. Two people who had been broken by the world, but who had chosen to rebuild themselves together in the vast, unforgiving, and beautiful Wyoming frontier. The ink dried on the page. The story of the Coldest rancher and the weeping widow was finished, but the legacy of their chosen love had just begun. This story leaves us with a powerful lesson. Real strength is not in closing your heart, but in protecting the weak, forgiving the broken, and choosing love when life has been cruel. This channel shares cowboy western stories, frontier romance, motherly love, compassion, and meaningful tales about human kindness. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe to join us for more stories.
When the last page of Abigail and Harrison's story closes, what remains is not just a tale of the old Wyoming frontier. It is a lesson about the kind of strength that cannot be measured by a gun, a ranch, or a man's reputation. Harrison believed that survival meant becoming cold, silent, and untouchable. Abigail proved that true survival means keeping your heart alive, even after grief has tried to bury it. Through a starving widow, an abandoned child, and a broken rancher, this story reminds us that family is not always created by blood. Sometimes family is built by choice, by sacrifice, by shared pain, and by the courage to stay when the world becomes cruel. Abigail teaches us that dignity is worth protecting. Even when we have nothing left, she refuses to be treated as property, refuses to sell her soul for safety, and refuses to let cruelty decide her future. Harrison teaches us that even the hardest heart can heal when it is met with patience, compassion, and love. And little Samuel reminds us that the innocent must always be protected, because the way we treat the weakest among us reveals who we truly are. The greatest value of this story is compassion. Not the soft kind that only speaks pretty words, but the brave kind that acts. The kind that feeds the hungry, shelters the abandoned, forgives the wounded, and stands against injustice even when the cost is high. In the Wild West, many men believed power came from fear, but Abigail and Harrison show us that real power comes from mercy, loyalty, and respect for human dignity. So as you leave this story behind, remember this. A person may be broken by loss, but they are never worthless. A home is not built with timber alone, but with trust. And love is not proven in easy seasons, but in the storms we choose to face together. Thank you for listening to this Western tale of courage, love, motherhood, and redemption. If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to the channel for more stories about cowboy life, Western love, motherly sacrifice, and the healing power of human kindness. All elements within this narrative are fictional and crafted for storytelling purposes. The author bears no intention of referencing real people, cultures, or events in a literal sense. Readers are encouraged to engage with the work as a piece of creative expression rather than documented reality.